Today is Friday, June 7th, 2024, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. I am John Robinson, here once again with my podcast co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, it's been a very, very busy week. How are you doing today, this Friday?
It has. The Sabbath sometimes feels like sliding into home base, you know. Well, I say that. I'm the least sports experienced person I know. But yes, it's been a challenging but positively busy week. Mm-hmm. And the Sabbath is coming tonight at sundown. Very excited about that. So I hope your week has been good also.
Yes, good. Busy, but feels productive.
Yeah.
I feel sorry for all those people out there that feel like the law's been done away with and they don't get to appreciate how awesome the Sabbath can be. Well, I mean, the Sabbath is always awesome, but like more awesome at times than
you
others.
Appreciate it sometimes in a different. What do the kids say now? You can listen. Oh, it hits different. Is that what they say? You know, there's something about it that just does feel different. So, yep.
So, what are we talking about this afternoon? Still technically this morning. What are we talking about this morning into early afternoon?
We are actually going to talk about your article, Mr. Robinson. We looked at the issue coming out, the July-August issue, and there's an article you have in there concerning what's normal and not normal and how we should feel about that. And when I saw that, it just seemed to me, it's like, that would be a great topic for the podcast as well. Everybody can look forward to reading your article, and they get a preview of it today. So that's our topic today.
That sounds great. Let's do it.
Thank you, Jake and Julia, and welcome back to the Living Youth Podcast. And so today we are giving you a bit of a preview. I can't say I can add a link to the article we're going to be talking about today to the livingyouth.org website because it doesn't exist. I mean, it exists, but you guys don't have it yet. It's not online yet. It won't be coming out until next month. It's in the July-August issue of the magazine. It's an article titled Our Abnormal Normal, and it is by my co-host here, Mr. John Robinson. So we do want to talk about that, but before we do, let me use this as an opportunity to also remind you that if you'd like to reach out to us and send us an email with an idea for questions or topics, then please do feel free and do so. The email address is podcast@livingyouth.org. And let me also say, this is something that's been come up a bit new, that sometimes Mr. Robinson and I would say things like, hey, teens and young adults, feel free to leave a comment there on YouTube if you have something, because we are among our platforms. We have Spotify and Apple, but most of you are, it seems like, doing the podcast on YouTube. And I've been expecting all this time for YouTube to notify us when there's comments for moderation, because with a lot of our church stuff, we have haters and stuff, so we definitely moderate comments. But in this particular case, we haven't gotten anything all this time. We just thought you guys weren't commenting. And then I randomly, I'd not looked at it before, but found the area where comments show up, and there had been comments. But if y'all have been leaving comments, YouTube has been deleting them, and when they're not approved, like within, I think, 2 months, they'll keep it for 2 months. And I checked to see that email notifications is turned on, and it's turned on. So I do have a question into our IT department, and Mr. Cassie is taking a look at it to figure out why we haven't been notified. But I did approve the comments that were sitting in there, which were, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 comments. And I just feel bad that some of you guys may have been commenting and we haven't been hearing it. And we'll whine about, if you guys want to leave a comment, feel free. And then maybe you've been doing that.
I was genuinely surprised we didn't have at least one comment.
I should have been pressed to be more curious earlier, now that we started this in 2022. So anyway, at this point, IT is looking into why we're not being notified, but regardless, I'm going to try every week or 2 or so to go and revisit that area to see if there's any comments just sitting in there. So anyway, I just wanted to extend to you our apologies and assure you that IT is taking a look at it, and we sure appreciate they're doing that for us. Okay, but let's get on to the topic of today's podcast, and that is this article. I don't want to talk too much about it because I'd kind of like Mr. Robinson to be able to do that for us and to sort of set it up. Mr. Robinson, when you wrote this article, I really appreciated how you launched it, and this is something that we worked with and refreshed because we published something very similar to this actually a number of years ago. based on this anecdote that you had in talking with your daughter. And so, if you could highlight that for us, what was the question? What was the conversation that sort of brought up this topic?
Okay, sure. So we were living in Austin at the time, and we moved to a suburb called Pflugerville. You guess how to spell that?
It starts with a P.
Yep.
You'd be surprised,
Yep,
right?
yep. And we had sold our house for several reasons, and we'd moved into a house that was there in Pflugerville. And so one of the things about it that was interesting, in fact, I was trying to remember, I think actually all three schools were around it, although the high school was a little further away. But you had the elementary school, the middle school, and even the high school not too far away, and they were all within walking distance. And that's when I learned about, I didn't know these kind of things existed. A lot of families move into these neighborhoods near the school so that the kids can walk to school. But what I didn't know was, we use the term families kind of loosely. And what was extremely common, and maybe we could even at some point comment on what I would say the difference between common and normal is, because normal really bears a pretty heavy weight for what we mean, especially from a biblical standard.
Right. And that's what we're here to think about, is think biblically.
Yep. So I won't even say normal. What was very common in the neighborhood, I don't think I ever lived in a neighborhood quite like this. The families, I would even use that term just a little loosely, in the sense that there was, most homes, it would seem, did not have an intact family. Maybe I shouldn't even say most, but half, like a high number, had either one parent. Sometimes it wasn't even that. Sometimes it was just grandparents. But you had lots of elementary and middle-aged kids, middle school aged kids. So in the U.S., middle school is 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. High school starts at 9th. So there's 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th for high school. And so there were just a lot of what we would call broken families in that neighborhood. And I know that there's going to be people out there listening to this who are in a broken family. That's one thing I learned at camp over the last few years that I was there, was that was much more widespread in the church than I had realized. And so I do want to say right up front, my following comments, I understand that there's a lot of kids that are in broken families, and that is not your fault. Like, that is.
Yeah, let me highlight that. I myself, my mother and father divorced before I was out of high school. And yeah, when we say broken family, we mean the way God really hopes all families will be. Circumstances happen, variety of reasons, and then some of us don't come from families. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean you can't be a family. Of course, you're a family, but that does mean that there's some extra hoops to jump through. If like even a case where, say, a father dies early, then mom has to figure out, well, how do I make up for that for my kids? And so there are extra burdens that some bear.
That's a good point, because we know of some people who have had a parent die while there were still kids in the house, and that's so tough. Okay. So I think what was unique about this was Maddie, who was 10, 11, and 12 in the 3 years we lived there before we moved to Charlotte.
I was about to say, wow, she was 3 ages at the same time. No, get it. During that
period. So it was a 3-year span. And I think it was when she was 10, because we'd first moved in there, and she played with a number of the kids. They had one friend in particular that they spent some time with, and she knew a lot of the kids in the neighborhood. And so one night in the evening, I think as the girls were going to bed, I was in there talking to him, and Maddie asked how come we weren't normal.
Interesting to word it that way, yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so that's kind of, this topic, because the first time I ever used this publicly was actually at Texas preteen camp. And I don't remember what I told, but something about being normal, and because every kid wants to be normal. Like, that is a very, very common thing. You want to be normal. So then the question becomes, what is normal? And I really am very thankful to God, because I was like, I'm thankful for two things. One, I recognize this is a very, very important moment for Maddie, which would be for any kid.
Right.
Any kid who asks a question like this. And I wanted to get it right. And I believe I whispered a quiet, quick prayer to God that he would help me give a good answer.
I call those 911 prayers. I
Yeah,
heard someone has
911 prayers.
nothing wrong with doing that. That's right.
And God answered my prayer because the way I was going to explain it was became clear to me pretty quickly. And so again, like I'm going to tell you what I said to Maddie, and I hope nobody is personally offended by this. I said, "Well, Maddie, you're playing with your friend, and her dad is long gone. We don't even know where her dad was. Her mom was there, so
This is the friend.
this is the friend, and she had a boyfriend, and a sketchy one at that." I said, because I know she also looked around and she would like to have played soccer or something, but so many of those kids games, little league and stuff, involve Saturday night or Saturday. Sorry, Saturdays was like little league, so there's just all this stuff going on. We were homeschooling the girls instead of public school, so that's yet another area where Maddie felt different. Like what's normal is the overwhelming majority of kids go to school. When they go to school, they go to Friday night football games. There's just this endless list of things that we didn't do, and sorry, Maddie, but Maddie is a very kind of conformist girl. Like she wants to know what the expectations are and like fit the expectations. She wants to be a good citizen, is the way I would put it. And so I said, well, Maddie, we could be like the other families around us here in this neighborhood. I said, but you know what that would mean? It would mean that I'm divorced from your mom. You maybe go and visit her sometimes and you stay with me, or you don't, or you stay with her full time and you only see me occasionally. Now I am, you know how men are. I'm not going to stay alone. I'll get a new girlfriend, right? And I don't even remember everything I listed off for her, but I painted the picture of what normal meant.
Right. Not that you, of course, wanted to do any of these things,
Right.
but that rather, if you're talking about us being normal, here's what that would look like in our family, right?
Yeah. And with Maddie, because we had grown up really emphasizing the family as the church has taught us, and what we saw with what I grew up with, our family was a how would I describe my family? We were tight and yet independent at the same time.
Interesting.
Yeah, but and I kind of had her at it would mean her family was broken up. That's kind of almost as far as that had to go. And so this ended up turning into something I did at Texas preteen camp, which then ended up becoming a sermonette I did a couple times at the feast, and then an article. But I thought it was important to frame what normal meant. So again, like what I would say is the behavior of the people in our neighborhood and the behavior of most of Western civilization, frankly, what is common now? Well, common is we don't even get married anymore. Kids are born out of wedlock. Just the catastrophic effect that the sexual revolution has had on the family, that's what's common now. But when you look at it from God's perspective, that's not normal. That's why framing what normal is really important. And then that was kind of the end of the story with Maddie. But like it was so heartfelt the way she asked me. And I knew it was important that she understood why we were different. And that's another way you could frame it. Why are we different?
Right.
And I'm like, we're different because the way the other people have lived their lives has led to significant consequences. And we avoid most of those consequences by doing it God's way, which is what I would say is normal.
I remember first hearing you address that topic, some years ago, and I just thought it was a great way to address that. Well, you just described that. Well, you're thinking normal, but what you really mean is common. What are you seeing around you? And also, if you think with a time shift perspective, which we can talk about before we close the podcast, that what will be normal, right? I mean, really, and then you look at the long term. What should decide what's normal? But part of what I appreciated about the article, and why I think it's all the more timely in this current issue that's coming out, the July-August, is how what is normal has just so radically changed. It's, why are we using the word normal in some of our articles? In telecast, we have an article and a telecast that I did on the war against normal. Mr. Weston I think it was Mr. Weston that telecast just recently also about what's wrong with what's normal, right? Why are we why is everything about what's normal shifting? And I say there's a secular fellow that I he's a biologist. He has a Substack that I haven't paid to subscribe, but I read enough of his articles for free that it's still very beneficial. And he'll feature other writers, but they're secular minded. He is very blatantly, he's an evolutionist. He does not believe in God. And yet, even they have somehow discovered, wait a minute, you know what's going on? You know what queer theory is? It's an attack on what's normal. It's trying to change what's normal. And it's like, well, yeah, I hope you should have been reading Tomorrow's World magazine. You know, we would have seen that already. But that's exactly what's going on. And so we do have this societal shift concerning what is normal. And one of the things I like in your article was that you kind of cited prophetically, like what Paul says in 2 Timothy chapter 3. Well, here's what the end times are going to be in terms of, what's normal. Is that what was on your mind? I was trying to set that stage.
Yep. And it also helped that I had grown up in the church, because when you go to public school, you realize in fact, it really was a wake up call for me. I was so used to the Saturday, the Sabbath was when that, man, when I started going into elementary school in our neighborhood, that we it was in Arlington, Texas, actually. And we started going to public school, and I realized real quick, I was like, oh, I'm the weirdo. Everybody thinks Sunday, and then they don't even question it. Sunday is sort of the Lord's day. And if you're going to go to go to any church at all, that was on Sunday. And I was the weirdo who was doing it on Saturday. And then my dad, we weren't very old before he made us tell our teachers that we were going to the feast. And we had to get our homework assignments, something I was not good about. But I had to tell them, and that was difficult. And it seems weird. Here's one of the things I got hung up on was literally using the word "the feast." I have to go to the feast. And to me, it conjured up visions of steely knives and sacrifices.
Giant, really? I was thinking more like a turkey, a giant banquet or
the whole
still something like
thing,
that,
right? Yeah. And you sure didn't want to tell your friends you were going to something called the feast, because the tremendous peer pressure. You don't want to be different. You want to seem like you're one of the crowd. But I don't know. I just made my peace with it, and we go through high school, and I just knew I was never going to go to a Friday night football game. And man, I think only Florida maybe competes with Texas for high school football being the king.
It is like a religion, to be sure, in Texas.
It's a big deal, and so that helped me relate with Maddie, because I knew what that felt like to feel that different, and having grown up the same way in it. But when I started thinking about, hey, this is because I was up for camp that I needed to do one of the morning. It was not morning motivation. What do we call it? It's like Christian living.
Christian living. Mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh man, this will be really good, because one of the things that was great about camp was kind of this very topic. One of the things I think that's great about camp for our church kids, which is why, if this is enough of a reason on it by itself to
consider camp or to want to go,
to encourage parents to send their kids to camp, is they get together for a week, or if that's preteen, or 2 weeks roughly for a teen, of other kids that are, this is tongue in cheek, everybody, other kids that are weirdos like them, that go keep the Sabbath and keep the holy days and stuff. Right. And then you realize, oh, there are other kids like me.
Right.
And and hopefully they're comparing notes and realizing that there's good things about doing it God's way. And at camp, that's one of the things we're trying to do, is convince them that it is God's way. So that's one of the things I used was, so this is what I said to the kids. It's like, well, what's normal? Well, God tells us right before Christ's return what is going to be the normal, or really the common attitudes prevailing at the time. And so I'll read it. It's 2 Timothy 3, verses 1 through 5, very familiar section of Scripture. But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. And here's the description of the common attitudes at the end time. So if you want to be normal as the world views it, then this is the kind of behavior you're going to manifest. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers. I always put an emphasis on this one, disobedient to parents, because our girls saw that, how disrespectful the kids were to their own parents, and it bothered them. They had learned enough that your parents are worthy of some level of respect. Even if they're not perfect parents, you at least aren't disrespectful to them. It was like, well, if we want to be normal, oh, Maddie doesn't get mad at me. Maddie, if we want to be normal, then you're disobedient to us. You're unthankful. Here it is, unholy. That's got its own depth of meaning. Unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power, and from such people turn away. And so one of the things I tried to convince the camp kids of is like, we don't want to be like this, right? Like, this isn't... To be normal means we have all these terrible behaviors and we're mean to our friends and we're mean to our parents and all these kind of things. Let's be better than that. And then later I pivot to trying to convince the kids, not trying to convince them, explaining
trying
that,
to help them see
just a different perspective, a different see things through the vantage point of the Bible. So for example, our lives are really relatively short in the grand scheme of time. Where the church rightly teaches that humanity is about 6,000 years old. If we live 70 years, we've lived a pretty decent life. And so one of the things I wanted to point out is that, yes, right now, it's not common for people to keep the Sabbath and to keep the holy days. But once Christ returns, and he's got some non-negotiable laws he's going to put into place. And I can't remember if this is part of one of the scriptures I go to or not. Let me double check here. Oh, yeah, because we'll get to that in a minute. Everything changes. I tried to do this in a sermon at the feast, and I got choked up, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't finish it.
Really?
But one of the I was trying to point out to them was, once Christ returns, he establishes his kingdom, everybody starts keeping the Sabbath and the holy days, all of a sudden you're a legend. Because you were doing that before everybody else did it. And so you were actually normal and you were ahead of your time. And so that's not all. We'll have a couple other scriptures that we'll go through here in a minute. But just trying to change the mindset from, what we do isn't considered normal by people around right now. But after Christ's return, that will not only be normal, it will be expected.
Yeah.
And then as humanity lives that way of life, they'll start to realize this is a far better way than what we were trying to do before.
Right. Boy, I can't wait for us to pivot here in a second to the real normal, which is what Christ is going to establish. Let me add to what you said. I really appreciate how straightforward you made that with 2 Timothy chapter 3 concerning, hey, you want normal? Well, then here's what Paul says, the end times normal is going to be. And let me express some sympathy with some who might listen to all of those things and to hear things like, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers. And it's easy to think, well, my friends aren't all of those things. And I look around me and I see what seem like some pretty regular people that aren't all those things. Let me caution you about that. It's easy to draw that conclusion without really thinking things through. And it's actually a trap that even us older folks, here I'm in my 50s, it's easy to think, today's not normal, right? Today we've got drag queens reading in libraries and we have parades celebrating things that God condemns.
Which wasn't even normal 50 years ago.
That's right. But then I could think, but 50 years ago or so, that was more normal. But here is the thing, and this is the long-term perspective that we strive to have in the church, is that all from God's perspective, abnormal things that seem to be so strong today started off as small little seeds of abnormality in the past. And we can go back to the 60s easily, but we can also go back to the 50s. We can also back to the 1940s. You can go back to these times and you can see the seeds for what has become today all right there in the ground, starting to germinate decades and decades ago. It's sort of like when we accidentally... for those of us who are older, again, people like me, we can clamor for a more quote-unquote Christian America. Back when, people didn't go to church on the Sabbath, but they still cared about church. And you bet, I would rather be surrounded generally by people who believe there is a God than people who believe there's not a God. And yet, at the same time, the seeds for all of that are right there. When you adopt you don't have to adopt fully the harlot mother, if you will, and all of her doctrines. You can just adopt the doctrines of
Yep.
the harlot daughter, the adulterous mix of the truth of God with a few key lies, and the end result is still where we are today. So don't just write it off because you think, oh yeah, but I don't see all those things in the world. No, you see all those things. Either they're fully present or they're growing, and it is important to have that perspective.
So, I would even add to that because, you and I catch myself going, man, it was so much better in the 80s when I was growing up,
Yeah,
right?
I think the same thing.
And so even if you go back further than that, as you go back to the 1950s, which is often considered a real golden age in America, right? Back when the vast majority of people thought of, this LGBTQ, all of that would be deviant behavior, and certainly not promoted. And you if you were oriented that way in any way, you had to keep it secret. And it just was much more normal. Funny I would use that. What we would think of as a typical society. But here's the thing. Here's my point. Even if I went back in time and I was in the 50s and I was going through school, I'm still odd because I keep the Sabbath and I keep the holy days. In fact, it actually was worse. I would say it would be worse back then.
Oh, I would say so. Yeah.
Because not being normal meant more back then. And in the 80s, it loosened up a little bit. And so even though we were considered so different because of the Sabbath in particular, it was even more, my impression is in the 50s, it was even more pressure to kind of conform and not be some odd. Well, don't you believe in Christ and the Lord, and that Sunday is the Lord's day, and you just seem like a heretic,
right?
To want to go
right. You're those around you are that much more solid in their local Protestant faith or whatever they were going to. The live and let live attitude would have been even less.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, would have been definitely not as present back then. So yeah, don't get caught up in romanticizing even a time in the past because. No, the normal back then had its own problems. In fact, it really is interesting if you look at movies. And before they created the, I can't remember what it's called now, the motion picture something, the rating system. You look at some of the movies they were doing in the past, like around the 20s and 30s, just absolutely perverted stuff.
Oh, yeah,
I mean, before they actually put in the industry guards. Mm-hmm. All that stuff has still been there, right? It's just these kind of little laws, put into place. Yep. But at the same time, all that is just nothing but a temporary measure. So getting off track in that regard, I would like to move forward to the next part.
Yeah, no, exactly. Okay, so here's there's two scriptures I used. Again, I don't know how much a preteen camp is 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12, right?
Yeah, you said Maddie was like 10, 11, 12 or so. So that's like 5th, I think 6th grade.
Either 9 going on 10, but she was definitely not older than 10 when she asked about this. And so, trying to get a time perspective and really make a breakthrough with a kid that age is kind of tough. But I tried to say, hey, look, things are like this now, but when Christ returns, listen to this. So Isaiah 9, 6 and 7. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. And notice how the description, okay? And the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father. So there's one of our first, clues, everlasting. That everlasting is a long time, isn't it?
Forever, that's right.
Of the increase of his government and peace, there will be no end. No end. That's like unfathomable. But after his return, the way we are living our lives right now by keeping the Sabbath and keeping the holy days will be done forever. And there won't be a going back to the old ways. There will be no end upon the throne of David and over his kingdom. So it's just an expansion of his kingdom that never ends, to order it and establish it with judgment and justice for that time forward, even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. And then to put an even finer point on it, you may feel like if you're going to public school and you're younger and you still have to get off for the feast, that's stressful, okay? But notice how it's going to change after Christ's return. Not only will people start keeping the feast and the Sabbath, but like there's an enforcement on it. So Zechariah 14 and verse 16. And it says that, And it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations, this is after the end of the tribulation and the day of the Lord, and Christ has returned, he's establishing his kingdom. Everyone who is left of the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So the whole world will keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So that, again, that was getting back to, man, you potentially are gonna, your kids growing up are like a rock star in the millennium because you were doing it before anybody was doing it.
Right.
And the kids at that time will be in awe of the fact that you did it. Now, I know it won't quite work out exactly that way, but the idea is anybody who survives through that time and is now living in the post-Christ return, man, if they find out you were doing that in the previous life, that is...
Yeah, they'll be going to the feast for the first year. So honestly, I can speak from the perspective of someone who was a teenager when I started attending. I was 18. In my first feast, I was 19. And it awed me then. Here I am going for the first time. And of course, it's amazing. We were camping in the piney woods back when, it was a big sandy feast site. And it's stunning all the stuff you're learning. But then meeting others who, by the time they were my age, they've been doing this their whole lives. This was normal for them, right? Mm-hmm. And I was a little bit in awe of that this thing I'm experiencing for the first time, I've got so many questions and it's so new. And here's so-and-so, and here's so-and-so, and here's this other person. And this is what they know as normal. And yeah, it was impressive to me. It was, I thought of them as having a privilege that I was only now getting to enjoy. And it did mean something to me.
So, I would say to younger listeners, look, I've been there. My daughter's been there. All our kids have been there, and it's tough. It is tough to run against the grain. We naturally want to have some level of conformity to our peers around us. God put that within us, but resisting it has an eternal payoff. And in the future, that is how everybody will live. And so, I would just encourage you all. I know it's tough. But to keep going, because what's going to happen in the future? God will begin to heal the earth, and one of the main ways He'll start. Mr. O'Gwyn, in one of his Bible studies that he did, said, I can't remember what scripture it is. Fixing the family and reestablishing the Sabbath will be the two most foundational things God does when He begins to restore things. And I wondered about this. That's just a whole other topic. But the Sabbath, I wondered about, even though it's clearly important. But I think it's because of its tie back to the creation, because that commandment is clearly tied to the creation, and so a weekly reminder of who the Creator of the earth is will frankly be embedded in the Sabbath, and will be a helpful repetition for everybody. In one of our other podcasts, we kind of talked about how important repetition is for humans to really establish something, but back to the families over time. What will be normal is a mother and a father and kids. And then it gets even better. I think this is one of the things, this is the stage of life you and I are at right now. We're waiting for the first grandbabies. And you don't think about this so much when you're younger, but when you get to our age and your kids are full grown, and then they start getting married and they have their own lives, and then the grandkids. And then you begin to see this perpetuation of your family. And then I remember growing up very fond of my grandparents. We had up to a certain point. Later, some of my dad's siblings got divorced, but up until that point, there had been just no divorce. So we had this kind of unbroken 3 or 4 generations of life, and I remember being pretty fond of my grandparents, and just so for me to take on that role and watch my kids have their own kids, and just a truly endless line of just family that just gets built over time. I think that sounds so awesome, and then that will be what is normal in the future.
Right. So let's, here as we're wrapping things up, let's take what you're saying and help me sort of turn this into advice for our listeners, which is really what you've started doing. It sounds like one thing you're saying, if I'm understanding you right, is to focus on the fact that what you're living concerning God's way, the life you're seeking to live in the church, according to His laws, according to the faith of Jesus Christ, try to reorient your mind to realize, no, this is, in the end, this will be the normal. This really is. That if you look, I mean, really, the first 6,000 years into the reign of Jesus Christ, I mean, past the millennium on into God's, eternal future, then at the very least there, you've spent as much time, living the truth, compared to the past. And that's just the beginning of eternity. That this really is, that the life you're living is normal because it's normal to God. It's the rest of the world that is not in line with that normal. And it sounds like that's what you're saying is one piece of advice is to try to wrap your mind around that idea.
Yeah. Yes. What you're doing in the scale of eternity is what's normal, because God establishes what is normal, and also after Christ's return, you actually will be in a position to teach and help other people come up to speed with what you've been doing your whole life. That's something you forget about. I'll use one quick anecdotal example. When I worked at my old print shop, which has now been like almost 13 years ago. No, it's been a little over 12 years ago. It's so interesting because I became known. People understood that I was a little different, and
Sure.
but I would occasionally have coworkers, and I'm not patting myself on the back because I did not expect this. Coworkers, there was a couple different ways. One time, a coworker asked me for advice with their small child. A couple of coworkers asked me to arbitrate a dispute between them because they felt like I was going to be fair. But I had another guy who's a pressman come up and ask me how to fast. So just think about this, young listeners, if you will. If you've grown up in the church and you're like, I don't know much about the Bible, and you know what? Just living this life, you know more than you think you do. You could tell somebody how to fast, and you think, well, it's obvious. No, it's not. If you haven't been raised, sometimes there's a call to fast, and what people mean by that is you skip a meal, or you don't eat, but maybe you drink something, something like that. But a true, proper biblical fast has some pretty clear parameters around it. If you've kept the Day of Atonement, you know how to fast.
Right. You're not talking about a health fast. You're talking about, I want to seek God in this way. Right.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, and you even if you don't understand it perfectly, you have an idea of why we're doing it and what your mindset should be in the approach. So you know more than you think you do. And so maybe the idea of people who've never done it before is stressful to you, coming up and asking you for advice, but you know more than you think you do. Like it's getting ingrained in your life by living that life.
And think about that. I'm so appreciative that you said that, because those individuals coming to you, they, for all intents and purposes, were living normal, quote unquote, lives.
Right.
They weren't keeping the Sabbath and the holy days. They're watching sports games on Saturdays with their friends, whatever they're doing. And yet, when they saw a need, they came to you, and they would not have done that if you were just living the quote unquote normal life like they were. Exactly. But rather, your willingness to live an abnormal, quote unquote, life at this time, and in their eyes, helped to highlight you in some way that when they sought to grow or to learn, they recognized you were tapped into something they wanted to tap into. Because really what they didn't realize is you weren't living an abnormal life. You were living the true normal that God wants for all of us. So that actually, I think, folds into a second piece of advice that we can, there's a third piece of advice you actually gave earlier I'll try to remind us of. Okay. But the second piece of advice is to actually do more than just simply reframe your mind. Think of it as embracing this. Lean into the idea a bit that you're seeing different. I know it's a challenge because we all want to feel like we belong. But when we start to recognize, well, no, I have an opportunity. God has given me and my family an opportunity to belong to something larger, something more permanent. Lean into that belonging and then allow God to make those distinctions here and there. As long as you're not a jerk, then in making those distinctions in your life and people noticing that you're different, it's an opportunity to serve as an ambassador of something better and something wonderful. And is it difficult sometimes? Yes, it is. But yet, it's difficult for good cause. Sometimes the fact that something is difficult, it's not a sign of it being bad. It's actually a sign that it's something worthwhile. It's something that actually there's good here for me, and I should embrace the fact that this is difficult.
Yeah. Yep. No, I think that's a great way of framing it. And that reminds me of when Christ was talking to the Pharisees, and I can't remember exactly how they asked him about the kingdom, and he says, the kingdom is within you, and that gets misunderstood, and
Right.
so a lot of well-intentioned Christians think that the kingdom is within them and
Right.
like living in their heart, and even
said that he was among
yeah,
them, right?
Yeah,
right.
yeah, right. And and even good commentaries will point that out. It's like it's unlikely that Christ would say these Pharisees,
The kingdom's within you, rotten Pharisee. Yeah.
But like this is something that was tough for me to wrap my head around. Was, well, what does he mean by that then? Well, what he means is if you want to know what the kingdom of God is like, just witness my behavior and the way I live my life and the way I conduct myself and my connection to the Father. Like he's this is the way I put it. He's a 3-dimensional walking, talking representation of what the kingdom will look like. And we are that in miniature.
Right.
That's really what you're doing. That's what nobody thinks of it anywhere nearly this consciously. But I like the way you put it, and when you even model even poorly, like imperfectly, not poorly, when you model imperfectly a Christ-like behavior and attitude and model that, you're doing better than you think you are, and people could tell there's something different about you. And it's different than mainstream Christians who try to be like real Christian-y and talk about the Bible and the Lord and all this kind of stuff. Like it's different. And people can tell it's different. And you when you're doing that, you are mimicking Christ, and you're in our imperfect ways, we're modeling what the kingdom is going to look like, and that is what's going to be normal.
Yeah, you become a picture of the kingdom in other people's lives. The last thing I do want to say is, since we clearly need to wrap up, we actually have someone coming over here to see us in a second, but you did give a piece of advice. If it is difficult out there, reach out to the support system that Christ has given us in the church. You talked about camp, being able to spend time with others, and that just doesn't mean others that are your peers, but others in your congregation that God has given you. God has given us a group of people among whom we can be normal, and that is those who are also living that new normal today. So anyway, thank you, Mr. Robinson. Appreciate it so much. Appreciate the article, and I'm looking forward to everybody out there getting to read it.